This episode of Q Point Podcast is pre-recorded, produced and sponsored by Karina Quirk, broker at Next Home Experience.
Different views.
I know your story.
From different cues.
Incredible job.
He's David Quirk.
You brought it up.
And she's Karina Quirk.
Imagine.
This is
Q Point.
Joining us by phone today is Jake Lachance, Executive Director of the Maine Better Transportation Association, known as MBTA. Jake, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, my co-host and husband couldn't be with us today, but we thought this was a very important discussion, so we appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure to be able to do this.
For listeners unfamiliar with MBTA, what is your mission and who do you represent?
MBTA first started back in the early 1900s as the Maine Good Roads Association. And there's still counterparts across the country. The New Hampshire Good Roads Association also exists. And all of them really have the same mission, and it's to provide safe and effective transportation throughout the state. We work very closely with state partners and federal partners to be able to secure funding so a breadth of infrastructure and transportation modes are able to operate effectively. And really, it comes down to a lot of blue-collar jobs where folks from the construction industry, engineering industry, across the gamut, including metro, transit, bike ped, community development projects. We want to make sure that those projects are able to get off the ground, fully funded, so that communities and folks around the state of Maine are able to travel and go about their business in a safe and effective way.
How many members do you serve?
We have approximately 500 members throughout the state of Maine, and I have to give a lot of kudos to my predecessor, Maria Fuentes. She was at MBTA for over 30 years, and she became a real stalwart in the transportation industry, both at the State House and cultivating those relationships throughout the state. And I would not be here if it wasn't for Maria. And I don't think MBTA would be what it is without Maria either. She is now very happily retired and traveling with her husband and doing all sorts of fun things and enjoying family time now. And it's very well deserved. But I can't state enough that MBTA would not be where it is and the presence that it is throughout the state and at the State House if it wasn't for Maria.
So let's pivot to the transportation funding shortfall. What is your reaction to the current challenges that Maine is facing?
I think our first reaction was that we were a little disappointed and surprised. And the basis of that really comes from, in order for folks like the construction industry and engineering firms and all of the folks that do the work on all of these transportation projects, the two biggest things that are most important to them are predictability and consistency. These folks are planning projects multiple years in advance. They have a very fluid employee pool that they usually pull from. We obviously have a very short construction season here in the state of Maine. No work's being done over the winter. So they want to make sure that they are able to provide the services and provide the need that the state has in terms of building and maintaining this infrastructure. We know that historically, Maine, at least over the last 20 to 25 years, has been bottom of the barrel in terms of the lack of consistent funding, and our infrastructure has been crumbling across the board. Our bridge ratings are consistently low. Our road ratings are consistently low. Our metro and transit and ulterior modes are slowly gaining steam, but still low in terms of ratings across the board. The ACSC does a report card every few years, and Maine scores are not where they really should be in terms of bang for their buck. The amount of services and what Mainers are getting in terms of the funding that's going towards these things. So when we found out that that kind of consistency and predictability in regards to the work plan was going to be in flux for this calendar year in terms of the bids that are going out, that's something that we take very seriously.
What types of projects are most vulnerable? Do you know that at this point?
In the conversations that we've had with the department, they've been pretty transparent with us that it's really across the board of things that are going to be affected. It's not just bridges and roads. A lot of different communities are looking into community development projects regarding dense urban housing or any of the projects that have to do with suburban expansion. Obviously, the state of Maine needs approximately 80,000 units of housing over the next 5 to 6 years in order to reach their goal. So if that's going to happen, there obviously needs to be the infrastructure that supports that. From what we've heard is nobody's going to be immune from this, unfortunately.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Karina Quirk, and my guest today is Jake Lachance, Executive Director of the Maine Better Transportation Association. Well, I'm in real estate. I also serve on the Maine Association of Realtors Legislative Committee. So what you're telling me is some of these developments may be delayed?
It's certainly a possibility. We'll know from the DOT specifically what jobs are going to be cut here in the next few weeks. And again, in their new work plan that's going to be put out in the fall. But I don't think really anybody should be too comfortable in terms of one mode being safe or one method of transportation infrastructure being safe from what the DOT is looking to do.
Another example of the community projects that could be affected by these cuts is one thing I think the Maine DOT does really well is it works with communities and municipalities across the state for downtown revitalization projects. And what happens is these towns and cities are able to go to the DOT and say, hey, this is what we want to see out of our downtown area to maximize economic impact or maximize foot traffic or whatever the specific needs may be. And this is really important because those communities are able to really make these projects their own and what is needed for their specific area, because every community is different. And the fact that the DOT is able to have some flexibility with these projects is really important. And without the proper funding to do so, those projects won't happen.
And what is the size of the gap? I'm hearing $400 million. Is that accurate between state and federal?
Yeah, there is that matching effect that obviously happens. Historically, it's about a 4 to 5 to 1 match that the state gets from the feds. So every $1 the state puts in, they're getting about 4 or 5 back from the federal partners. In terms of the shortfall that we're looking at now, obviously there's a lot of things in flux at the federal level. There's a surface reauthorization that's going to be happening at the end of the fall. And everything that we're hearing from our federal partners, that is probably going to result in a new bill not being passed, but a continuing resolution happening. So that level of funding, at least for a short amount of time, will be staying the same, and then a new bill will eventually pass. But in terms of the state level funding that we're looking at, it's going to be still in that 175 to 200 million, possibly even up to 250 million that we're able to get. And that's over the course of the multiple out years in the current work plan. I think this is ripe for an opportunity really to tackle what this shortfall means in the work plan in the out years, because it just hasn't properly been dealt with in the past in terms of dedicated state funding.
And how did we get here?
It's a great question. I think there's a lot of factors that go into it. I do think that there's a little bit of a forgotten mindset when it comes to transportation. I think overall, folks just kind of assume that projects get done and roads will get fixed and bridges will be rehabilitated and bike paths get built. And I think people kind of take that for granted. But we do see that it's very popular as well. All polling for transportation bonds and efforts in the past are very widely supported across the political spectrum. So it's kind of a matter of really getting down and dirty and dedicating some money to what's really the backbone of the economy.
It's funny you mentioned that. It seems every election we're approving transportation bonds, but why aren't those bonds sufficient?
I think there's a lot of different reasons. First off, when you kind of get pushed to the back end of the line, so often there is kind of a buildup of little things over time that ultimately come to a head. And I think that's part of what we're seeing right now. Another thing, especially since COVID and the post-COVID era, there's obviously operational costs that have gone up. So when you look at the DOT ledger, and I'm sure the commissioner went into a little bit of detail there, but they obviously have their operational costs of what they're able to do in terms of fuel prices and manpower costs and all of those things in one bucket. And then they have all their capital projects in another. And I really think that the more focus that we can have on capital projects and making sure these projects get bid out and put back into the economy, that's the trickle down we're looking for. when bids are able to be put out, jobs are able to get done, roads and bridges and all those other multimodal transportation sectors are able to get a slice of that pie. And it's really kind of a high tide lifts all boats situation. So I think there's a lot of things that kind of go into play for that. But again, it really comes down to those two things, consistency and predictability.
I'm curious, were there transportation funding bills proposed during this most recent legislative session?
There was a big bond package that the administration and the House and Senate Democrats put forward through the appropriations process. That bond bill included not just funding for transportation, which was approximately $60 million of state funding. It also included housing initiatives. Agriculture is always usually a big sector that is also in the bond world. It was kind of grouped in with 5 or 6 other things. And there were a lot of political sways that kind of went through the session of whether or not that overall bond package was going to be moved through the legislature. At the end of the day, it was not. It takes 2/3 of the legislature to be able to vote through those bond packages, and that failed to happen, which I think is another facet in why we're kind of in the predicament today, was that money was not able to be, in the end, appropriated and allocated to be able to get on this June ballot. But I also think there's another facet where I don't think we had a very clear picture or the knowledge of what not getting that funding would mean in terms of the cuts for these jobs, which comes down to communication and being able to let industry partners help throughout the legislative process, which also kind of aided in that frustration of the cuts that are happening now. So it was a confluence of things for sure. But again, at the end of the day, we're not going to be in this position if we're able to figure out what consistent funding is available. So every year we don't have to go for a bond and fill that gap.
So are you saying the industry partners were left in the dark on this one? You didn't have a seat at the table?
I think there were funding issues that we identified throughout the session. There was a $13 million hole in revenue based on the revenue projections that ended up coming in lower than we thought, which created a $13 million hole. We were able to identify that during the session, and we were able to deal with it. And we thank the governor for including that money in the change package at the end of session. And I think if other needs were known and identified through the legislative session, we could have dealt with those things in a similar manner.
So how many projects are we talking? Do you have an idea of how many will be cut that were planned out for these monies?
The first round of cuts that happened earlier this spring was approximately $50 million. The upcoming cuts in the next few weeks, we're anticipating another $150 million worth of cuts, and then possibly up to another $200 million when the new work plan comes out in the fall. And again, when you extrapolate it out, all of those state funds are going to be matched. So it's one of those things where that trickle-down effect happens, and it's not really able to provide that consistency. One thing that's definitely going to be necessary come January of 27 with this next legislature is we're going to have to figure something out both in the short term and in the long term to make sure that this doesn't happen again.
So back to the federal funding, Senator Collins has brought in a lot of funds for the state of Maine, in particular for the causeways down in Deer Isle. Now, will those projects be affected?
Senator Collins has always been fantastic when it comes to supporting transportation and infrastructure related issues. Over the past 5 years, Senator Collins has brought about $1.5 billion into the state of Maine. Now, that's not just specific to transportation and infrastructure. Obviously, we've seen the work that she's done for local fire stations and police stations around the state, as an example. But we also have seen recently, over the last 6 months, she was able to secure around $25 to $30 million for airport repairs, which, if anybody has traveled through the Portland International Jetport, Director Paul Bradbury has done a phenomenal job in keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak, of keeping that Portland Jetport really a pleasurable experience for folks to be able to travel in and out of. And some of those things wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for the funds coming from the feds and the money that Senator Collins has been able to secure. So the earmarks are a little bit separate in terms of the Appropriations Committee from Senator Collins. And that is one thing that the transportation and infrastructure community has definitely been thankful for, because without that leg up and the specific projects, the Madawaska Bridge is another great example. That bridge would not have been worked on the way that it was if it wasn't for the federal funds that were able to be secured. So
the amount of state money that's needed to get those federal matching funds on the other side, outside of those Senate appropriation earmarks from Senator Collins, those federal monies are really important. We've kind of seen the state budget grow almost 2x over the last 8 years. And the amount of money that we're putting into those state transportation projects, we see that manifest itself 4 to 5x on the other side. But when that funding isn't consistent, then it kind of throws the whole system out of whack. So that's really our focus going forward, is to be able to get that dedicated funding so we're able to get that federal match on the other side.
So it seems to me, and I'm sure listeners agree, there are particular roads throughout Maine that when you drive on them, you think they would be better if they were just dirt at this point. For safety and other reasons, they are in such terrible shape. And I did ask the commissioner when we had him on recently, how did they determine which road is a priority compared to another road?
That's a great question. And it's funny, the history of Maine scuttlebutt too. I used to call my grandfather, and every time I was on the phone with him, he would always start with how the Red Sox are doing and if I hit one of the massive potholes on the way up to the Norway, South Paris area. It's always kind of one of those main things that are talked about. And I think the DOT for a long time, just based on the funding constraints that they've had to operate really in the MacGyver Band-Aid mode for a really long time, just because of the funding restraints that they have. And I think there are a lot of examples where those 15 to 25 year Band-Aids have been authorized and gone about, where there does need to be a pretty significant overhaul in terms of what is being done. The Frank J. Wood Bridge connecting Brunswick to Topsham is a great example of that. That's a 100-year-old bridge that was literally deteriorating and crumbling under the deck boards, and got a bunch of those 15 to 25 year Band-Aids thrown on it over the course of the years. But obviously, everything comes to a head at some point. So whether it's deciding to do those 20 to 25 year Band-Aid fixes or to do a complete overhaul where it could be necessary, it really comes down to the funding that's available and looking at it and saying, okay, can we get by for now and be able to work on other projects in the same fashion? Or have things come to a head where we say, okay, this thing needs to be taken care of the right way so it has another 75 to 80 year shelf life opposed to 20 to 25.
Do folks go out and inspect all the roads and then classify them? Or do they go with citizens calling in and making complaints? Do they go through the legislature? How is it actually determined which roads get addressed first?
Every fall, the DOT creates their 3-year work plan. It's a rolling 3-year work plan. So this past January, it was put out, the fiscal years 26, 27, and 28 work plan. And the DOT sets up a war room within themselves when going through and creating that work plan. And they decide, they have the whole full list of priorities that they hear from not just folks around the state, but they obviously have their own internal kind of lists and information that they go on. And they go ahead and sit down and suss all of them out. And sometimes there are projects that make the cut and sometimes they're not. And it comes down to that dedicated source of funding. I think if the level above the treetops was able to be lifted more with more dedicated funding, you'll see a lot more of those projects that are more conducive to that 75 to 80 year shelf life opposed to the 20 to 25 year, just because those projects are usually more expensive and more money has to be dedicated to them. So they figure that out through their own internal process.
You are listening to Q Point Podcast. I'm Karina Quirk, and my guest today is Jake Lachance, Executive Director of the Maine Better Transportation Association. I presume that you testified during committee hearings, is that right?
I did, yes.
Is part of the conversation what happens to Maine's economy if the roads, the bridges, ports, rail, airports, if they're underfunded?
Yeah, I do think that's a big part of it. And I do think the DOT has that holistic view when looking at things. Like I said earlier, throughout the legislative session, there were different funding mechanisms that were identified, like that $13 million revenue hole that we were able to identify, we were able to fix, and we were able to find money for. The biggest thing for us is knowing and having the communication with the DOT about where the funding is at, what is needed for that particular year, so we're able to tackle it all together. If during the past legislative session there was other needs that were identified that we needed to deal with, I'm confident that we would have been able to do so.
So that's why there's another facet into why we were surprised when kind of the breadth of these cuts were going to be happening.
So where do we go from here?
It's a fantastic question. I think there are a bunch of different ways that we can shore up funding on a long-term level. One is within the past 3 to 4 years, we were able to secure 40% of the automobile sales and use tax. Beforehand, that money, 100% of it was just going into the general fund. And a bunch of folks sat down and said, okay, this tax revenue of buying new cars and vehicles, and which ultimately results in more cars being on the road, that's obviously going to have a detriment to the roads in terms of how good they are, the shelf life of those roads with more vehicle traffic. So there was kind of a correlation made between transportation affected funding and that tax revenue to go directly into the highway fund. So they were able to secure 40% of that revenue to go into the highway fund to help fund the work plan. That resulted in an approximately $100 million shift into the highway fund. But over the years, that's proven to not really be enough. And whether it be costs or management of funds, that $100 million, it definitely helps, but it's not enough. So we're going to be looking to really solidify that number. We think it makes a lot of sense because it's not a new tax. It's a tax that's already happening, and it would just be more of a shift from the general fund dedicated to the highway fund to be able to support that kind of main economy outlook that we're talking about. At the end of the day, it's really the movement of goods and people that keep the state moving, especially from a tourism level. And we want to make sure that the infrastructure is there to be able to back that up. So we think a higher percent of that automobile sales tax should be dedicated to the highway fund and not just going into the general fund.
And what are your chances of getting that done?
Well, we tried last session with a bill that was sponsored by Senator Farron from Somerset County, who sits on the Transportation Committee. There was a push to be able to do that. But obviously, when you're taking money from the general fund, there is a hole that is created in the general fund that some folks, especially on the Democrat side of the aisle, weren't comfortable with. So that was also before we kind of knew kind of the dire straits that we're in now in terms of transportation funding and what that means. So even though we weren't able to get that bill over the finish line last session, we're hoping we have some momentum and people see the real tangible need for this dedicated transportation funding because of the cuts that are happening now, because we never want to be in this situation again.
Will there be an emergency session, do you think, for this transportation funding shortfall, or are they just going to wait?
So in order for these monies to be secured now, obviously the legislature would have to come back in. I know that some conversations have been had about what that means and what the effects of that would be. And we're still kind of sussing through that of whether or not that's a tangible option or not. But those conversations are ongoing.
As we wrap up, what's one thing you'd like listeners to know?
I think that one thing that we're really focused on, and one thing that has been a priority for MBTA for a long time, is really making sure that the levels of communication between us, the DOT, all the other industry partners, whether it's the multimodal people or AGC Maine is a great example. We're open to being a seat at the table and need to be a seat at the table throughout all of these conversations regarding funding. I think it's apparent that we have a very wide umbrella in terms of what this means for the Maine economy. Like I said earlier, our members comprise of contractors, engineering firms, transit, metro, the airports, bike ped folks. All of those are really important to the movement of goods and people throughout the state of Maine. And in order for that to be as effective as possible, we all need to be on the same page in terms of what's needed. And I know that between myself and the commissioner and a lot of other folks, we all have the same goal. We just need to be in a position to be able to execute that goal to the best of our abilities. So something like this doesn't happen again.
Jake Lachance, Executive Director of the Maine Better Transportation Association, thank you so much for joining our show. We do appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime. Have a great rest of the summer.
You too.
You've been listening to Q Point.
Follow us at qpointpodcast.com or on your favorite streaming app.
This is where you can get the news from the people who make the news.
Make sure to join us next time.
We hope you tune in.
Q Point Podcast invites guests and candidates from all parties to join the conversation. The views, information, opinions, and comments expressed during this program do not necessarily represent those of the host, Q Point Podcast, associates, affiliates, and CQRE LLC.
Thanks for being a part of the conversation. The most important voices aren't always the loudest ones. They're the voices of everyday people, raising families, running businesses, serving their towns. That's who we want to hear from. Share your ideas with us online, and let's make sure those voices are never left out. Find us on Facebook or on X or at qpointpodcast.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Catch every episode at qpointpodcast.com or wherever you stream. Tune in and tell your friends.